The Trump administration regards Russia as a peer, as a peer power, as an equal, one of three, perhaps alongside China as well. That's a very Cold War mentality, bearing in mind Russia's relative lack of strength.
From The Times, it's The World in 10. With me today, James Nixey, Director of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. James, welcome.
Thank you very much.
We've seen some pretty universal condemnation of those attacks on Sumy on Sunday, including from people within the White House. Does this strike on what seems to be clearly civilian targets show something's changing in how this war is being fought?
It shows that very little is changing in how Russia is fighting the war. Russia's modus operandi is indeed pretty much a scorched earth policy. If it can't control Ukraine, it will wreck it. And that is precisely what it's doing. It is failing to win, really, even at the diplomatic table right now, although we can go into that in more detail. But it's certainly failing to win militarily as it initially wanted. So that leaves Russia to exert its military superiority, which it still has, over Ukraine. And that is indeed, shall we say, an irritation to the Americans, not in and of itself, not necessarily in a sort of a human sense of the word, but because it makes it look as though the American attempts to force a diplomatic end to this war are not working, as indeed they are not. And why not? Because of Russia. Ukraine has bent over backwards to agree to this deal, to cede all sorts of to make all sorts of concessions. It's even made the concession that it might be willing to look at a loss of territory in some respects, at least temporarily, to say nothing of agreeing to the Black Sea deal and not to strike inside Russia at Russian energy infrastructure targets. And meanwhile, Russia does what we have seen in Sumy this weekend with appalling loss of life, and really the pictures, you can't tell 1,000 words. So we are looking at the usual efforts from Russia to scupper the peace process, because ultimately they do not want to have a outcome which concedes anything. The Russians have so far not made any concessions to their own ambitions and wants. And if you look at Lavrov's statement that we need to address the root causes of the war, those root causes of the war, according to Lavrov, are the eastward expansion and enlargement of NATO and probably the EU as well. And ultimately, that is a step too far for the West, even for America to agree to. It cannot retreat back to pre-1991 levels and force posture. So that's where we are.
What can we read into the fact that the attack came so soon after Steve Witkoff, the White House envoy, met with Putin in St. Petersburg?
Yeah, it is a bit of a two-fingered response, is it not? And but again, that is part of the Russian modus operandi. It shows a certain disdain and contempt for what the Americans are trying to achieve. Agree with that or disagree with it, on the American side, that is. And so it's sort of akin, albeit more deadly, to Vladimir Putin making US presidents of the past, popes, other leading statesmen and dignitaries wait for hours on end before he deigns to meet them when they come to Russia. So the Russians feel no compunction about such niceties, and certainly not, of course, don't have the same value in human life as our Western values generally do. Not to say that we are angelic or perfect, obviously. So I think that it shows that Russia is not serious about its side of the peace process, by which I mean by calling this to an end, to ending the fighting whilst it has not achieved what it wants. And what does it want? It ultimately wants control of Ukraine. It needs Ukraine to bend the knee, a different government, a puppet government. And then, for now, and I mean only for now, Russia would be temporarily satisfied, but not until then.
You touched before on the concessions, the idea of Ukraine accepting a loss of territory. Steve Witkoff seems to be saying, let's give Russia the ownership of those four eastern regions of Ukraine. That's the fastest route to success. Is that what it will take to bring peace for Ukraine?
No, Ukraine will not really accept that, not even in the short term. It's gone too far for too long and spilt too much blood for that to be an acceptable outcome. On the American side, let's say, of course, the Americans don't care that much. That is to say that it's not a bargaining chip in a negotiation if you don't value what you're bargaining. Bargaining chips have to hold some sort of value. So it's an easy thing for somebody like Mr. Vitkov to give away. But for the Ukrainians, they're still in this fight. They're not subjugated or beaten just yet. Yes, they face serious disadvantages with a likely pullout of US support, and of course being outgunned and outmanned as they always are. On the other hand, of course, defence has always been an advantageous position in this war, and they are on the defence, and that means that the Russians are not making that much progress on the ground militarily. As for the four regions themselves, they are not. Again, these are large enough swathes of land for it not to be an acceptable point to the Ukrainians. And I think the Europeans, for their part, are likely to back the Ukrainians on this. They can't go along with the Trump administration on this one because they do value. They're not perfect. They're slow. They're not up to speed. But the reality is that they are, at least rhetorically, for what that is worth, backing the Zelensky government at this point, even if unity is frayed because of the Hungarians and the Slovakians and the Austrians, etc. But nonetheless, the core quorate momentum of Europe is still with Zelensky on this, and that's important.
When we think about those four regions, the thing that Witkoff says is they're Russian speakers, that perhaps they belong with Russia, which is a kind of Kremlin talking point that we've heard again and again. Indeed, one newspaper accused Witkoff of taking the Kremlin's side. Trump's been implying Russia hadn't meant to target those worshippers killed in Sumy. How worried is Europe that the White House is taking what could be a pro-Moscow approach?
Well, I think Europe has been worried about this for a long time, albeit prepared for it. Well, perhaps prepared for it since there's already been a Trump administration, and is used to having a United States president who is, anything up to a potential Russian asset. But if not a Russian asset, then certainly somebody who acts like one. And so I think the intelligence establishments of Europe have protected themselves in this respect and are not sharing to the same degree that they once were. But yes, it is entirely clear and has been, as I say, since Helsinki in 2018, that Donald Trump generally prefers the word of Vladimir Putin over that of his own intelligence agencies and government departments. So that is a world that we are actually quite familiar with now. It's just much more visceral this time around because in the first Trump administration, we weren't at war. And in this administration, of course, we are. So it hits that much harder. I don't think that the Americans are going to back down on this, would be my final point here. Because I think when they face this kind of criticism, their instinct is not to make any concessions, but to double down. So we're not looking at a situation where America can bail Europe or Ukraine out anymore. If anything, it's going to continue along this way. The only fly in that ointment, to go back to your first question, Stuart, is the fact that it is the Russians who are continually being the awkward player here, and that does not help the American efforts to force this to a close. The Americans would be quite happy to force the Ukrainians to concede on territory, on control. They would pretty much accept the Russian talking points or the Russian demands more or less as is, although, as I say, not the 1991 force posture point. But again, that does not seem to be enough to Russia. And it speaks to the idea that Russia demands or seems to need an antagonist, an adversary. And the great adversary, as the Iranians would say, the great Satan there is the United States. So we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that the Russians now consider the Americans to be on side. Actually, the Americans are A, unpredictable under Trump as they are, and B, ultimately the natural enemy as the Kremlin sees it.
In terms of this ceasefire, do you have a sense that Putin is taking talks to progress it seriously?
At the moment, the talks are useful to Vladimir Putin, so he's going along with the process. But I think that is ultimately not the Russian endgame ideal. It's not to end this because of an American brokered process, because the Americans would take the glory and the Russians would still come away looking quite shabby. Ultimately, what Vladimir Putin needs to survive out of this is to get something substantially more than he started with. So that's not really conducive to the idea of talks, even though the Americans are willing to give away quite a bit of Ukrainian silver in the process. We're still in a situation whereby the US is not an honest broker in this situation, and that does favour the Americans, who ultimately did bet the farm on Trump winning the election, even if he's more unpredictable. Obviously, with Donald Trump, then there is a pendulum of extremities. He could either sell Ukraine totally down the river, or, I suppose, and this is what the Ukrainians are hanging on perhaps, he could get irritated with Russia, and this brings us back to the Sumy question to a small extent, and arm Ukraine to the hilt like it's never been armed before, to quote the US administration. So that pendulum of extremities is very much in evidence under the Trump administration.
How do you rate the chances of a U-turn like that by Trump? And can warm relations between Moscow and the Trump White House last?
I don't think that there is enough of substance for a properly warm friendship. Obviously the US is pursuing rapprochement. It's pursuing normalization of relations with Russia at the expense of Ukraine, at the expense of much else, in fact. But and I suppose that is because the Trump administration regards Russia as a peer power, as an equal, one of three, perhaps, alongside China as well. That's a very Cold War mentality, bearing in mind Russia's relative lack of strength. Only 150 million people in Russia compared to 350 in America and 500 million in Europe. So Russia is pretty much outmanned in real terms, like Ukraine is in the theatre of war itself. But I don't really believe that that there is anything to. We've had resets before. They tried under Obama, under Hillary Clinton as state sec, and it just didn't work. And the reason it didn't work because ultimately, as all presidents and prime ministers in the West find out, Russia can't really be bargained with. A kind word and diplomacy simply don't work. Russia wants what it wants, and that is eventually found from everybody to be unacceptable. So all leaders have to learn Russia. Some learn it sooner rather than later. Probably the Trump administration will learn it later rather than sooner.
So should we just despair? The path to a ceasefire seems to be heading far off into the future. What do you see the next 6 months looking like?
Well, the path to a ceasefire being heading far off into the future does not necessarily imply despair. It may be, and I don't wish to sound callous here, but I'm only reflecting the wants of the majority of the Ukrainian population, that a continuation of the fighting is the best thing for Ukraine in the longer term at least, whereby ultimately Ukraine gets to be sovereign, free, independent, and whole. But it can't do that with a ceasefire, because if a ceasefire is enforced and Kremlin demands and talking points are adhered to, then that's actually not in Ukraine's long-term future, or future interest, I should say. So perhaps I'd just slightly turn your question on its head and say that that's not a reason to despair. It's a reason that we haven't bent the knee just yet to the American coercion as far as this theatre of war and its wider implications for the security of Europe are concerned.